Good evening. Welcome to another of the University of Delaware's Carlson International Polar Year lectures. I'm Fritz Nelson of the UD Department of Geography, and with Lisa Griffiths, who has been recently elevated to the university's Associate Provost for International Studies, I co-chair the Carlson IPY Committee, which is, as I think most of you probably know, charged with bringing these events celebrating the International Polar Year to the university and the people of the state of Delaware. We are very fortunate indeed to have Michael Robinson with us this evening to deliver the third Carlson Public Lecture. We'll introduce Dr. Robinson formally in just a very few minutes. Along with a lecture by Camille Seaman 2 weeks ago, this evening's lecture marks the opening of two very special exhibitions, co-sponsored by the Carlson IPY Events and the University of Delaware Museums. The first is the subject of the talk 2 weeks ago, Camille Seaman's The Last Iceberg. The second, which is of very great relevance to tonight's lecture, is a series of photographs, most of them taken in the 19th century, under the title Poles Apart, Photography and Science in Polar Exploration. And I'll say a very few words about that in just a few minutes. Before we introduce Michael, I'll turn the lectern over to two esteemed colleagues. The first is Dr. Janice Tomlinson, the director of the University of Delaware Museums. Janice.
Thank you, Fritz. And I didn't realize that Fritz just told you what I was going to tell you. So I am going to underscore what Fritz just told you. I'm director of University Museums, and it's really been my pleasure to partner with the International Polar Year to present the two exhibitions that Fritz mentioned, The Last Iceberg, photographs by Camille Seaman, and Poles Apart, Photography, Science, and Polar Exploration. What Fritz did not say is that he was seminal in bringing together the exhibition Poles Apart, going out to the AGS library in Milwaukee, selecting photographs, helping us edit and create labels for that exhibition. And the other thing that Fritz didn't tell you is that he will be giving gallery talks on that exhibition, also working with his colleague Brian Nelson, who will talk to us about Camille Seaman's photographs of icebergs. Those gallery talks are scheduled for October 17th and November 12th at 5 p.m. at the University Gallery, which is at Old College, and I do hope you'll join us. And again, I want to thank Fritz and the International Polar Year for helping us bring these exhibitions to campus. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Janice. Just a couple more words before I bring on the next speaker. It's very important for me to point out that support from the university's colleges is really critical to the university's IPY events, not just because they provided much of the funding for the series, but because these are the university's fundamental organizational units. Support from the colleges, allows us to stitch the Carlson IPY events together in such a way that it makes them truly a university-wide enterprise. So it's now my distinct pleasure to introduce the Dean of the University of Delaware's College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, Dr. Robin Morgan. Dr. Morgan's college has been a very generous supporter of the Carlson Project since the idea for the series first got off the ground. The college also has very significant involvements in the polar regions. Robin.
Thank you, Fritz. Welcome, everyone. As Dean of the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, it is certainly my pleasure to be here participating in this installment of the University of Delaware's W.S. Carlson International Polar Year event series. I first heard about this university-wide effort when Fritz stopped by my office almost a year ago, not quite, to describe his ideas about what we should do to celebrate the International Polar Year. He told me about how many Delawareans, how many blue hens, both in the past and here now, had ties to polar exploration. His enthusiasm was so infectious that I signed up immediately as a supporter, and my college recruited him later on to give one of our public talks during our spring 2008 Ag Day, and he did a great job at that, I might add. Fritz's efforts this past year have served as a model for campus and community engagement. Gathering together from time to time to collectively think about something important and something interesting is vital for the intellectual richness of our campus and our community. This slide that you see up there is one that Fritz found for me. I don't take any credit for that, but it is actually a slide taken by William Carlson, and it was taken in 1942. He took it when he was in the military and making a run across the North Atlantic from Newfoundland to Greenland to Iceland and to the UK. And Fritz, I think, got that from the University of Toledo, didn't you? So this is not a small accomplishment to have this slide. The University of Delaware is a land-grant university with a strong tradition of agricultural research and outreach. President William Carlson, who took that picture you just saw, for whom our International Polar Year events are named, was steeped in the traditions of the great universities of the American Midwest. When he came to UD in 1946, he had previously been at the University of Michigan and the University of Minnesota, both schools that have strong colleges of agriculture. According to the UD historian John Monroe, immediately after World War II, Carlson tried to reshape the University of Delaware in the image of these Midwestern universities that so promoted agriculture. Perhaps Dr. Carlson would take comfort in knowing that his cause, the one that was near and dear to him, remains very much alive at UD today, championed by people like me, who talk to anybody who will listen about urban and suburban agriculture, about landscapes and the fragility of coastal communities. Nancy, you talk about this too, about the balance between food and fuel, the worldwide agriculture outlook, and of course, chickens. UD's involvement in agricultural research in the far north goes way back, nearly 70 years. As far as we can tell, the first ag research in the high latitudes was undertaken in 1949. Emma Stoll, who was a professor of education and geography, received a summer research grant from the university to work in the Matanuska Valley in Alaska, just north of Anchorage, on problems that were associated with homesteading that took place there during the New Deal. And what you see on this slide are some pictures of that. We see some of the early homesteading farms, and then we see this really giant cabbage. I'm not sure how old that child is, but it's certainly a giant cabbage, no matter how old that child is. And then we see some other pictures of the Alaskan agricultural endeavors. The Matanuska Valley is also the site of the University of Alaska's main ag experiment station, so it's probable that back in those days, in the 1940s, there was an element of collaborative work with the University of Alaska personnel. This last slide shows some of the University of Delaware's study abroad trips to Antarctica that took place just this past winter in 2008. Jake Bowman and John Cox from the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources led this study abroad, and students there could enroll in 4 courses: Communication of Natural Resource Issues, International Perspectives on Wildlife Conservation, Nature and Wildlife Photography, or Advanced Wildlife Photography. And most of the photographs that are taken and shown on this slide were taken by these students. Many of them have appeared in International Polar Year events during this year, and they're notably in a prominent collection of polar artifacts that's been in the Morris Library in February and March. The Carlson International Polar Year events are overseen by a committee. We call them the Carlson Committee. Fritz Nelson and Lisa Griffiths are the co-chairs. Other members of that committee include Kathy Geiger from Geography, Dana Varon from Marine Studies, Bernard Herman from Art History, Dave Kirchman from Marine Studies, and Tom Sims from Plant and Soil Sciences. Support for the project comes from the Office of the Provost and from each of the university's 7 colleges. The project is co-sponsored by the American Geographical Society from New York. Will those people who are here, whose names I call, please stand if you're here, and will all of you join me in thanking Fritz and this great committee for their work in organizing this series. Thank you. Stand up if you can. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robin. The IPY's International Program Office in Cambridge, England, has organized events in the 4th International Polar Year, that's the one that we're currently in, around a series of what are called International Polar Days, which are quite cleverly scheduled to coincide in a very general way with the solstices and the equinoxes. So the Carlson Committee has tried to follow the sequence of these polar days just as much as we could, and it turns out that this evening we are spot on. September 24th is People at the Poles Day. So I don't think that anything could be more appropriate for a day with that particular designation than to have a lecture about polar exploration that occurred in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and the surprisingly large role that it played in popular culture. The Poles Apart exhibition, currently showing in the University Gallery, is all about polar exploration during this period. The fact is, the rise of photography as a medium of artistic expression and of documenting events coincided with the development of polar exploration. So we have really, I think of it as an extraordinary interfingering between the two enterprises. Several of the sets of photographs in the exhibition are also closely tied to the development of the International Polar Year concept in the late 19th century, and I'll be developing that theme in the gallery talks that Janice mentioned next month. Now, before I introduce this evening's speaker, it is my very great pleasure to offer 3 acknowledgements. The first is to the American Geographical Society Library, which is a unit of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. In particular, I'd like to express my thanks to Christopher Baruth, this director of the AGS Library, and to the AGSL staff, particularly Susan Peschel, Jovanka Rustic, and Kay Gildner. If you're watching tonight, hello, thanks. Without the enthusiastic help of these very, very professional people, the Poles Apart exhibition wouldn't be here at the University of Delaware. It's as simple as that. And another critically important point, most of the photographs in the show come from the collections of the AGS Library, and we are extremely grateful, as Janice mentioned, for the loan of these materials. Our second debt is to the Milwaukee Art Museum, a very spectacular institution, both, as you can see, architecturally and in terms of the various shows and things that it puts on. We also owe a debt to its associate curator of photography, Lisa Hostetler. Dr. Hostetler developed an exhibition called Photographs from the Ends of the Earth, which showed at the Milwaukee Art Museum during the last 3 months of 2007. The Poles Apart exhibition at the University of Delaware includes many of the photographs that Lisa selected for the Milwaukee show, and some of the wall texts and the labels in Poles Apart originated with her. Lisa generously shared information with us and gave her approval to the Poles Apart show. And there's a third debt, and this is arguably the most profound one. None of us, indeed, would be here tonight if it wasn't for the American Geographical Society, which tonight's speaker has called the headquarters for Arctic exploration, end quote, during the late 19th century. AGS sponsored many polar expeditions between 1851 and 1950, but the pages of its journals are filled with accounts of those voyages. But unlike a lot of the other organizations of that time, AGS always insisted that science should play a major role in any of the activities that it sponsored. And again, we'll discuss this at greater length in one of the gallery talks later this fall. We are indeed very proud of the fact that the American Geographical Society is our partner organization in the Carlson IPY events. The AGS Council, which is pictured here in front of its old building in Upper Manhattan, has offered absolutely tremendous, stupendous, I would say, support for the Carlson project, including, as many of you know, the loan of its Flyers and Explorers Globe last winter to kick the series off. Poles Apart also contains two additional, I guess you could call them eye candy, two original watercolors that were found recently in the archives of the AGS in New York City, one of them by Robert Peary himself. So, without further ado, it's my distinct privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Michael Robinson. Dr. Robinson is a historian of science and teaches in Hillier College in the University of Hartford. He's serving as guest curator at the Portland, Maine Museum of Art early next year to mark the centennial of Peary's most famous assault on the North Pole. See how carefully I worded that? Little inside joke. You'll get to that if you go to the exhibition. And he serves as an advisory editor for a History of Science journal, ISIS, and runs a fascinating blog. You'll love the name of it. It's dedicated to the history of science under the title, Time to Eat the Dogs. Professor Robinson's book, The Coldest Crucible, is the subject of tonight's lecture. This book has received, I've seen it firsthand, critical acclaim and popular success. And I can attest personally to the high quality of this book, The Coldest Crucible. After hearing Michael speak earlier this year at a conference on polar exploration in Philadelphia, I obtained and read his book, every last footnote, and I have to say I really enjoyed it. Probably more important is the fact that I learned a heck of a lot from it. So you'll have a chance to get a signed copy during the reception following tonight's talk. So again, it's my very great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Michael Robinson of the University of Hartford.
Let's see. Put this here. Thank you, Fritz. That's very, very kind. I was talking to Fritz earlier today when we were walking over here, and he was saying, well, we're thrilled to have you here. And I said, I know, the pleasure is all mine. I don't know how many graduate students are here. Are there any grad students? Yeah. So I did a lot of this work in graduate school, and I remember there being lots of wailing and gnashing of teeth as I spent years in archives thinking, the only people who are ever going to read this are my dissertation committee. And so it's a great pleasure for me to talk to people who are actually interested in the wonky, geeky stuff that we do in archives. So thank you for coming. I wanted your help in a little mystery. The slide that I have up, the slide that I have up is a body lying in state in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. The scene is the last half of the 19th century. The man who has died is an American hero. He's a leader who has died at the pinnacle of his career, the height of his success. Congressmen, governors, and Supreme Court justices have marched in procession behind his body. And his funeral cortege will take three weeks to cross the country, where it is greeted by, for example, greeted in Baltimore by women in the thousands dressed in mourning, scenes that are repeated in in Cincinnati and Columbus and other cities. So I just wanted to ask, what's your bet? Who is the man who is Lincoln? How many people say Lincoln? Lincoln? I probably gave it away by the next slide. The man is Elisha Kent Kane, who was an Arctic explorer and who died in 1857 of rheumatic fever as a young man. I think he was 37 years old. Until Lincoln's death 7 years later in 1865, as far as I can gather from every record I've looked at, this is the largest funeral in American history. He was an Arctic explorer. And in a way, Kane's death raised questions for me, questions that really guide my book. Why were Americans so obsessed with Kane that they would turn out like this? In fact, there's actually a book that's published in 1857 called Obsequies to Elisha Kent Kane. It is a book just of the eulogies to Elisha Kent Kane. It fills probably 200 pages, which also describes the various funeral events. So why were Americans so obsessed with him? And what role does the Arctic play in the rise of Kane as a public figure? And finally, I guess, was there a bigger story here? Was there a way in which Arctic exploration could tell us something more about what American culture was like in the middle of the 19th century? So those are really the questions that I try to answer in my book, The Coldest Crucible. There's been a lot of stuff written about the Arctic. I don't know if we have any Arctic buffs here or polar buffs, but probably you know just from the newspaper how much Shackleton is talked about and how much other explorers like Robert Peary are talked about. In fact, it doesn't seem to be a genre of writing that ever dies. It just seems like more and more stuff is produced about the Arctic. And yet, there have not been very many works that really have asked the question, what does this stuff mean to the people back home? Why were these stories so important? And so that's really what my project focuses on, is what do they tell us about life back in America? Elisha Kane is a good place to start. Elisha Kane, this is an engraving of him in 1853, does not seem to be the stuff of heroes. At the age of 30, when he started his career as an Arctic explorer, he was a very small man. The descriptions of Kane vary, but most put him at about 5'5", 5'6", weighed 120 pounds, and was of delicate health. He suffered from rheumatic fever, which was an affliction probably caused by an untreated strep infection, which eventually afflicted his heart, or staph infection, I'm not sure, but an affliction that affected his heart and affected the valves of his heart, and ultimately would kill him in his late 30s. So Kane originally heads to the Arctic not as the commander of an expedition, but as the officer of the first official American expedition, the U.S. Grinnell expedition, which leaves the United States in 1850 to look for a missing British explorer by the name of Sir John Franklin. I'm pretty sure Franklin. No, there he is. Franklin had left Britain in 1845 looking for the fabled Northwest Passage. Not that there was really any reason to find the Northwest Passage. Initially, way back in the 15th, 16th centuries, the British and other northern European countries were very interested in a Northwest Passage as a kind of way, a northern route to get to Asia, where other countries like Spain and Portugal had dominated the southern routes around Cape Horn and the Cape of Good Hope. So at one time, the search for the Northwest Passage had a legitimate economic motive. But by the 19th century, pretty much everyone realized this was far too cold a voyage. There'd probably be too much ice in these passages for it to be commercially viable. And yet, for the British, this was a matter of great prestige, a way of showing off the power of the British Navy. A number of British expeditions to find John Franklin had failed. He sailed in 1845, and by 1850, even though he was provisioned for many years up in the Arctic, people were getting nervous. At the behest of Franklin's wife, Jane Franklin, the American government was employed to try to send its own expedition north, and Kane sailed as the naval officer of the first Grinnell expedition. The expedition didn't find Franklin. Franklin at that point was already dead, we know, but did find evidence of his first winter campsite along with some British expeditions. And that was enough for Kane when he came back from this expedition as a medical officer in 1851 to make the pitch to the American public that the United States should send another expedition north to find Franklin, that Franklin probably was close by, and that with him as the commander, he would be able to find John Franklin and bring him safely home. So Kane headed out on his own expedition, an expedition that did not go very well. This is a great illustration. This illustration is actually from well, I've got it here. This is from the book that he wrote upon his return called Arctic Explorations. This was a huge hit, by the way, in the 19th century. This was like the equivalent of Harry Potter or Sebastian Junger's Perfect Storm. I mean, this sold 100,000 copies in the 1850s, which was just an insane number of... Anyway, so if anyone wants to look at this afterwards, I've got it. But this is an illustration from that book, The Kane Party, Winter Quarters. Kane didn't do very well. He headed with his crew up in his ship Advance to Smith Sound, which is a sound between Greenland and Ellesmere Island. The ship was encased in ice and basically locked in a harbor, Rensselaer Harbor. Kane's party quickly grew frustrated with his command style. Kane was used to being a doctor, but he was not a very good commander. And you can kind of see it, I think, in the expressions of people. Everyone looks kind of grumpy. You have the two people, one holding a shotgun on the side, where Kane is staring away from everybody else over in the distance. Eventually, people grow so frustrated with Kane that they try to make half of the crew decides to secede from Kane's party, and they try to head south on their own. They don't make it very far and are kind of forced back. And then Kane finally, after 2 years in the Arctic, is forced to admit that the ship is never going to leave the ice and head south with his men, where they are rescued in some of the southern Greenland settlements. So Kane returns in 1855, having lost half of his crew to mutiny, 3 of his men to frostbite, and his ship. But he's treated as a tremendous hero. And that was the thing that was very interesting to me, is why people were so astonished by and thrilled that Kane returned. And I think in trying to make sense of this, I think, well, part of it is probably a kind of Shackleton-esque story, right? Where it's not as much that he did anything that was important in the Arctic, but he got back home when everyone thought he was dead. That was impressive. So I think there is that quality of being kind of escaping the jaws of death that really impressed Americans, even though the rest of his goals were essentially failed. But there's more to it than that. As I began to dig, especially looking at those eulogies of Kane after he died, other things became more apparent. One thing I think is important to realize is that at the time that Kane becomes an Arctic explorer, it's the year 1850. 1850, to our minds now, might seem like a relatively quiet time. The Civil War doesn't start until a decade later. But in fact, things are really heating up in America. If you look at the map, for example, this is a map of slave states and free states. And if you look, I have a pointer here. Here are the slave states, here are the free states. If you look, there is all of this territory in here where the status is somewhat ambiguous. And this was a critical issue for Americans in 1850. What would happen to these new American territories? Would they come into as they became states, would they be free states or would they be slave states? And the issue was not simply one of morality. Certainly in the South, for them, they viewed it as a question of the viability of slavery as an institution. Because if these states if these territories became states that were free, the South would not be able to garner a majority, especially in the Senate, which would really undermine its ability to maintain slavery. And that is the crux of the issue, really, that led to the Civil War that broke out with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So it's in this context where there's already fighting in the Kansas territories, and the case of Dred Scott has already riled up Northerners about the fugitive slave law. It's in this context that you have Kane heading up to the Arctic to plant the American flag in northern regions and to try to find this British explorer. In the eulogies of Kane, what's really interesting is that Northerners and Southerners alike praise Kane for his feat of nationalism. And it became clear to me that in a way, the Arctic became a place where Northerners and Southerners could agree on a kind of nationalist project. Here was something that wasn't going to get people angry or fired up. Here was something that everyone could agree on. He represented Americans, and this area, the Arctic, was a place where he could do all of the work with empire without the messy details of having to kind of call it free or slave. The other issue that I think is important to realize about Kane is the way he is described. There is certainly plenty of illustrations of Kane after he dies, wearing furs, looking rugged. But in fact, the more interesting part of Kane's eulogy is that people were very impressed with Kane, not for being a tough guy, but for being a man of cultivation. It's a little bit hard to see. Any chance we could bring down the lights? Well, if it's possible. But I'll tell you what the scene is here. This is Kane aboard the Advance. So he's actually in his ship. You can tell that it's nighttime because, there's a guy here that you can't see, but there's a man sleeping on the side. And Kane is covered in furs, and he's spending his time probably writing his narrative, writing his journal, or writing down scientific observations. Kane, when he dies, is praised as a man of science and cultivation, not as being a tough guy. In fact, I have some of the quotations. So, for example, John Fraser, who was a scientist and a local of Philadelphia, said of Kane, "His was a scientific mind by which he was enabled to see the connection which lay between phenomena." So this is a scientist. The other interesting thing about this picture, which was painted, by the way, also after Kane's death in 1859 by Thomas Hicks, is look how pale he is. I mean, from where you're sitting is practically the only thing you can see. I mean, he looks like he's about to die of blood loss. He was a man of very delicate health because of rheumatic fever. You would think that his eulogists would play down the fact that he was such a weak guy, but no, they play it up. Listen to some of the eulogies of Kane. His strength of character, quote, raised his feeble frame above bodily weakness. Another writer wrote, he was prone to seasickness whenever there was a breeze enough to cause the slightest swell. And one of his crewmates said, his palate was delicate, but he accustomed himself to eating puppies and rats. A housemaid who worked for Kane said of him, praised him for his, quote, pretty, gentle manners, his sweet young face, and his lovely complexion like a girl's. And another wrote that he had the gentle qualities of a woman. These are not the kinds of descriptions we usually associate with the Arnold Schwarzenegger brand of explorer. And I was struck by this when I read it, that people were playing up his frailties rather than playing them down. And I began to realize as I saw this figure of Kane that one of the bigger stories of Arctic exploration is you begin to get a sense of what it means to be a male hero in the 19th century. In 1850, it was not about muscularity. It was really about a kind of inner will. The reason I think that eulogists played up his frailties is because it created a contrast with his inner strength of character, his self-control, And it's really in highlighting his frailty that you see he had a character that could overcome these frailties until he eventually died. So that is something that's, to me, was interesting. And I'm going to come back to this issue of tough guy manliness later on when I talk about Robert Peary. But I want to give you a kind of highlight reel of some of the major expeditions in the 19th century. There's a bunch I can't cover. The searches for Franklin continue way beyond the point at which you would imagine that Franklin could possibly be alive. There were actually expeditions to find Franklin in 1865, which was 20 years after he had been lost. And there were all kinds of theories that somehow he had been adopted by Inuit tribes in the high Arctic and had gone native and was living the Inuit life. I'm not going to talk about that. But there increasingly, if we kind of roll through, there is a tendency in the late 19th century to downplay from the Franklin search. And the American Arctic expeditions that head north increasingly become interested in the search for the North Pole. And one of the major expeditions to try to reach the North Pole was put together by a naval officer, George Washington DeLong, who was the leader of what was called the Jeanette expedition. DeLong was a naval officer himself, but the expedition was funded by James Gordon Bennett, who was the publisher of the New York Herald. And this really signals the beginning of corporate sponsorship for Arctic exploration in the 19th century. Really, after this point, you see the increasing involvement of publishers, private patrons to fund these expeditions. DeLong hoped that with this ship, the Jeanette, which is named for Bennett's daughter, Jeanette, that with this reinforced hulled ship, the Jeanette, which is here in San Francisco Harbor, they could sail up through the Bering Strait. And it was hoped that the open water of the Bering Strait would continue north all the way to the North Pole. There's an elaborate theory behind this. It's called the theory of the open polar sea. But for the purposes of this talk, it is enough to know that they were wrong, and that the Jeanette, when it sailed above the Bering Strait, quickly got entangled in pack ice, drifted for about a year slowly over the top of the Asian continent above Siberia, and was crushed by the ice about a year later. The parties of the Jeanette made their way slowly across the pack ice, tried to get to the Siberian continent in whaleboats. Ultimately, a small number of the Jeanette crew were rescued. 17 died, including DeLong himself. So these are the survivors of the DeLong expedition. This was a wake-up call for Americans in the Arctic, and it really began some soul-searching among the American public. What is the objective in going to the North Pole? Originally, we could say that it was finding Franklin. That's a humanitarian objective. Or there's the issue of Kane. Kane was a scientist. He was taking scientific measurements of weather and climate, of currents, and other things that could be useful to scientists back home. But the DeLong expedition was merely to try to get to the North Pole, and a lot of people die. Do we want to support these kinds of expeditions if the goal is a kind of symbolic goal or a kind of sport? And so, another major expedition in the early 1880s, the next great American expedition, which is called the Greeley Expedition, or the official name for it is the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition. The Lady Franklin Bay Expedition heads out in a way to turn this idea of sport exploration on its head. This was going to be the first truly scientific Arctic expedition. And in fact, the Greeley Expedition 1881 was a part of a much broader project, the International Polar Year, which we celebrate the 4th number of today. So during the first International Polar Year, the objective was that Greeley, who's seated here with the major beard, facial hair, in the front, that he would head north with his group to Fort Conger, which was in Upper Ellesmere Island, adjacent to Greenland. And at Fort Conger, he would be one of a number of other Arctic stations from other countries. They would not be running up to the North Pole. They would stay put on Ellesmere Island and dutifully take measurements about the Earth's magnetism, weather, climate, take species collections, collect species, do some geographical description of the local regions around the camp, but they would stay put, because that's how science is done. You don't need people dashing up to the North Pole to do real science. You need to stay put and gather data. For 2 years, it works pretty well. The Greely expedition collects an enormous amount of data, and it collects this data in conjunction with other Arctic forts in Siberia and in Northern Europe and other places. But after about 2 years, Greely decides that it's time to start running his own sledge trips north to try to see if he can break the record of farthest north. So after about 1883, Greely can't help himself. He starts sending these sledge expeditions to see if he can break the record. And he does. They make it almost to the top of Greenland. And he does make a new record. Like the DeLong expedition before it, though, the Greely expedition ends very badly through a combination of poor judgment and bad luck. Greely is not relieved by the relief party that was supposed to get him in 1883, or in 1882, or in 1883. And finally, by 1884, he says, well, we've got to head south on our own. So he heads south with all of his party, with very few provisions. And slowly, really mostly because of starvation, that party begins to die. So that when he's rescued in 1884, there's only 7 members of the party left. Here's the quotation of Greely when he is rescued. They find him in the tent. I can't remember, but Lieutenant Connell of the Schley expedition finds him. Greely is emaciated. He's lying in tattered rags. He lifts his head and he says, "Here we are, dying like men. Did what I came to do. Beat the best record." The thing that struck me about this kind of line, which probably is apocryphal, he probably didn't say that. In fact, there are other people who wrote into the margins. There were other people in the expedition who wrote into the margins that he said something like, "Can't you leave us alone?" Some other line. But in any event, it's a good line. But it's in effect, it's absolutely not what Greely came to do. Right? Greely's whole objective in going north was not to find the North Pole or to reach farthest north, but to do this kind of methodological science that had never been done before in the Arctic. So, in a way, even though the first international polar year is held up by many people as this incredible body of scientific work, it was deeply frustrating to most American scientists because they see Greely rescued and they say, "Oh, God, it's not about science, it's about the North Pole again." And then Greely comes back home and they find out that a lot of the bodies of the people who had died had been cannibalized. So that was in the press for months. And then there were questions about Greely's ability to lead his men. In fact, we find out months after his return that one of his men was summarily executed for stealing food. So these are the stories that become the most kind of remembered stories of the first international polar year. By contrast, there's another American camp at Point Barrow in Alaska. The Americans in that encampment do all of their scientific work. Nobody dies. They all come back. And no one talks about them ever again. So you can see that although the story on paper is one in which science triumphs, in reality, it convinces scientists that they want nothing to do with these polar quests. And in fact, the American Geographical Society that Fritz mentioned, which is the headquarters of American Arctic exploration in the late 19th century, kind of secretly, they send out a letter to prominent American scientists with the question, is Arctic exploration worth all of the blood and treasure? And they get a number of responses, and these responses still exist at the American Geographical Society in New York, where some scientists say, well, yes, I guess there's some good reason to head north. But most of them are like, no, this is a waste of time. Let's do real research. And actually, after the Greeley Party, at the disaster of the Greeley Party, increasingly the North Pole quest becomes, I think, the closest approximation we can say is it becomes a form of sport. You see, for example, in the late 1800s, Walter Wellman, who is himself a reporter, he works as a reporter for a Chicago newspaper, he gets the deep pockets of his publisher to put up a motor balloon expedition. Wellman had tried to make it to the North Pole using the traditional methods of dogs and sledges, but he was a reporter. He didn't know anything about sledging and dogs, and he ended up breaking his legs so badly it turned gangrenous. The lesson that Wellman took from that experience was not that he knew nothing about Arctic exploration, but that there had to be a better method for getting to the North Pole. So for him, it was really not a question of, should we be heading to the North Pole, but how can we get to the North Pole more effectively? And his solution was, if the problem is all of this broken ice, let's just send a motor balloon over it, where we don't have to deal with the ice at all, or dogs, or any of that other messy stuff. And so you can see here, in 1906, he is standing in the wheelhouse of the motor balloon America. Love the name America. It's actually completely of French design and manufacture, designed by a Parisian balloon manufacturer. He takes it up to Spitsbergen on a number of different expeditions from 1904 to 1909. It fails. One of the reasons it fails is that he only has a 50 horsepower engine on this thing. So it works great if you don't have any wind, but if you have any breeze whatsoever, it goes all over the place. There were other technical problems with it, but suffice it to say, he never makes it. And finally, in 1909, while he's setting up for another attempt at the North Pole, he's beaten to the punch by Robert Peary and Frederick Cook, who both come back in 1909 claiming to have reached the North Pole. That story, the story of their controversy, which still continues to this day, is deep and long, and I'm not going to talk about it very much, except to say that it really does, I think, represent this kind of last straw for scientists and the public in viewing the Arctic as something that has any purpose besides adventure. So I did want to say one thing, though. Peary, if you, getting back to Elisha Kane, I was mentioning before that Elisha Kane is praised as being this kind of almost effete, weak guy who has this kind of inner strength of will. Robert Peary, by contrast, is someone who is very educated. He's educated at Bowdoin College, does very well. He's trained as an engineer. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He works on a transoceanic canal in Nicaragua. He gives scientific papers. So here's a guy who is very much a professional, and on top of that, he's a naval officer. And yet to look at Robert Peary and hear him talk, the guy came out of the Stone Age. He's always dressed in furs, I shouldn't say always, there are pictures of him wearing tuxedos. But for the most part, Peary was very careful to be profiled in furs, usually with a beard, and that you can really see that in a way what it meant to be a manly explorer had changed by 1900. Peary designs this very elaborate ship to help him break through the pack ice in the far north. The ship he named the Roosevelt, which was named after his buddy, Theodore Roosevelt, who was also known, and probably some of you know because Theodore Roosevelt is such the icon for John McCain right now. Theodore Roosevelt was this kind of iconoclastic guy who was always promoting the strenuous life in the outdoors, wrestling bears, rustling cattle out in the West. He was someone who, as much as his own pedigree was very elite, Harvard educated, lived in Manhattan, was someone who wanted to be seen as a tough guy. And Peary, and took that on to the point of naming his ship after Roosevelt. But my favorite Peary quote, which really I think gets at it, Peary is speaking to the International Geographical Association in 1904, before his North Pole attempt. And he's talking to an international audience of explorers. And he says to them, essentially, I don't care who makes it to the North Pole. It could be anyone in this room. Doesn't matter. We are all of one blood, the man blood. A very different kind of hero than Elisha Kane 50 years before. Okay, this is the point at which, if we were a purely academic audience, someone would politely ask, I wonder if you could speak to the meaning of this, which is the kind of polite way of saying, so what? Why do we care about all of these explorers in the 19th century? And so I want to, I have a picture, by the way, of the controversy over the North Pole. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Why do we care? So what? I mean, interesting stories. But there are, I think, reasons to take this history seriously. The first one is that the obsession with who discovered the North Pole that you see represented here, it's not gone away. I mean, it hasn't gone away in relation to Peary and Cook. You can still find books being published about this. Fritz and I attended a conference where we couldn't get away from the subject of who discovered the North Pole. But it has become a model, I think, for modern sports adventurism, extreme sports adventurism. In fact, if anyone wants to go to the site Explorer's Web tonight, just go to the site, which is a site actually by two kind of extreme travelers themselves, who write about the various attempts to climb Everest, to climb K2, to be the first person to climb, well, there's plenty now, but to be able to climb all the 8,000 meter peaks all over the world. These are expeditions that are extremely expensive. It costs anywhere between $40,000 and $60,000 to climb Mount Everest. And in order to get that kind of funding, travelers will find corporate sponsors. And to get that corporate sponsorship, the sponsors want something in return. They want photos. They want their logo on the top of the world. And so increasingly we see people who their claims are suspect. They don't make it up to the top of Everest, or they take someone else's photos, or they represent someone else's photos as themselves. And so this kind of mountain bagging philosophy really grows out of this early attempt to make it to the North Pole. But I think there's an even more important reason we should take these expeditions seriously, and that goes right to the center of space policy today. If you look at the history of NASA in the 1980s and the 1990s and our current state in 2008, you see a number of parallels with the North Pole quest of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. See if this kind of rings a bell. You have the space shuttle expedition of 1986, Challenger, which blows up and the crew is lost. There's a period of time where NASA essentially shuts down the shuttle program to do what? To retool this technology to make the shuttle safer. And then again, you had, in 2003, the loss of another shuttle, Space Shuttle Columbia, which also began a period of soul-searching for NASA. But what was that soul-searching about? George Bush, speaking shortly after the Columbia disaster in 2003, came up with what he called the Vision for Space Exploration. And it's a document that goes about 1,400 words. But if we boil it down, basically what George Bush asks NASA to do is send Americans back to the moon with the hopes of using that as a platform to go to Mars. Now, this is an interesting question because we already have all kinds of spacecraft on Mars. We have robotic rovers, 2 rovers, which have far exceeded their life expectancy. They're still trekking about the Martian surface. You also have the Phoenix lander, which is now up in the the Martian Arctic regions, looking for signs of water and geology. And so there's all kinds of remote robotic craft that are now on Mars. So the question is, what is the objective of sending human beings into space? And it seems to me that there is no objective apart from this kind of vague symbolic idea that to do space exploration, it's got to be people. That there's a kind of symbolic power to sending people to do really dangerous, potentially lethal things. And in fact, if you read the space policy of John McCain, who has a much more detailed plan than Barack Obama, John McCain's plan is, well, scientists will tell us that there's not really that many good reasons to send humans into space, but we should do it anyway because it's impressive. And then he goes on to list what the Chinese are doing and what the Indians are doing and what the Japanese are doing in their space race. I think right now is a moment of soul-searching in America. And then we have to look back and realize that just like Walter Wellman, NASA, I think, is thinking about these issues about technology. But what they're not asking is the question, why are we doing this? Do we need to be sending human beings into space? And what ultimately is the consequence for science? Because the space scientists I talk to say that the incredible expense of sending human beings up in craft and then bringing them back down alive is coming out of their budgets. So I'll leave it with that soapbox passion. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Was the United States embraced with other countries, England, for example, to be the first? Was this a competitive, not just internally, but foreign as well?
There was a British expedition. The British did try to make it to the North Pole as well, up until about the 1870s. And then there was an expedition that was widely touted in which the British lost a number of men to scurvy. And at that point, the British decided to pull themselves out and then increasingly move their attention to Antarctica. So you begin to see the Scott and the Shackleton expeditions after that. But there were also, I tell you, the most interesting expeditions, I think, are the Norwegian expeditions. You have Nansen, who heads north. Nansen is a kind of Elisha Kane-esque explorer. He's a man of great education and erudition. He's someone who is a leader of artistic movements. He becomes, I think, the ambassador of Norway. I can't remember to whom, but I think he becomes an ambassador. But he designs, based upon the tragedy of the De Long expedition, which gets caught in the ice and drifts, Nansen comes up with this idea, maybe we should intentionally create a ship that can be locked in the ice and drift to the North Pole. So he helps design this ship called the Fram, which he intentionally sails into the ice pack. And it's shaped like an egg. The bottom, it's very hard to sail, but it's shaped like an egg on the bottom. So as the pack ice begins to squeeze it, it just pops up on the ice. And, Nansen's got paintings, he's got music, he's got pickled herring. I mean, they're having a fine old time drifting around the Arctic ice cap. And I think, as far as I can tell, no one dies. So there's a real kind of innovative spirit, I think, particularly to the Scandinavian attempts. And there's also, I think, a lot more attention to doing basic science in the Arctic as well. But yeah, a number of people get involved, even the Italians. Abruzzi from Count Lord Baron Abruzzi. heads its own expedition north. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a great one. The question was, if, for anyone who didn't hear, is are there parallels with the current attempt to lay claim to the North Pole? So there was a undersea expedition by the Russians about 6 months ago where they planted a flag on the sea floor at the North Pole in an attempt to claim it as, I think, part of the continental shelf of Russia. What I find really interesting is that exploration is a very big term, and a lot of people are beginning to view it kind of commercial or resource exploration as something that can be linked up to these early nationalist ideas. So why claim the North Pole now? Well, when the ice melts, which it's probably going to do within about 40 years entirely, suddenly the Polar Sea becomes this fantastic trade conduit between Asia and America. That would be good to control, as well as petroleum deposits under the sea. So yeah, they're definitely pulling on those earlier, national exploits. Yeah, question?
Available are the logs from these expeditions, and how revealing are they about the feelings of success or failure? What Shackleton's is very complete.
They vary. Some of them are closed and difficult. In other words, some people like Kane are writing, I think, very much with an eye towards publication. So occasionally he'll let his anger or his depression show, but a lot of it is, you can see he's kind of writing in the style of an eventual publication. But there is some pretty revealing stuff, especially in letters. There's a lot of letters, and in fact, there's great stuff not too far from here. If anyone does Arctic exploration or is interested, the Smithsonian is the Disneyland of Arctic stuff. I mean, they have, at the American Museum, they have Charles Hall's journals, and they have his ephemera, they have his letters. At the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, they have all of Elisha Kane's material, as well as letters to his secret girlfriend, and I mean, it's great stuff. Yeah. So I guess there are lots of revealing, materials. Question, yeah.
We have a question from one of our viewers in Second Life. What did the science of the various expeditions teach us?
It's a great question. Well, my answer to that, I guess in brief, is for the 19th century, not a whole heck of a lot. Science was most often used as a rhetorical device for raising money back home. And there was a kind of quid pro quo between explorers and scientists, where explorers promised to bring back lots of good stuff, and in return, scientists, particularly at the nation's institutions like the Smithsonian and the Coast Survey and the Naval Observatory, would go to Congress and fight the fight to get funding. So there was lots of talk of science before these expeditions headed north. But usually these expeditions came back with pretty meager returns. And even in the case of Greeley, Greeley had a tremendous body of data. And in fact, that initial IPY, if you look at it, it's a tremendous body of scientific data. The question is, how much does it get used? And as far as I can tell, it doesn't get used very much. So I hate to be a downer on this, but I think really it's a kind of a weak record of scientific accomplishment. Question, yeah? Mm-hmm. The graves, I think if this is what you're talking about, there are 4 graves, I believe, on Beechey Island, which is above the North American continent. There's an archipelago of islands. And Beechey Island is right on the northern edge of Lancaster Sound. And in the first year that Franklin is out, these 4 men are died and buried. In fact, for Kane and other people who found this stuff, this was a very good sign, because they were buried with a great deal of care. Each of the graves of these Franklin men, they have gravestones that are, chiseled with their names and when they died. The graves themselves are dug into the permafrost. And in fact, the bodies are still in pretty good shape because they're buried, below the permafrost line. So someone about 20 years ago actually dug them up. And you can see photographs of these people who died. But so those were the 4 bodies that they were able to identify by name. They seemed like they were in pretty good shape. And for a lot of people in the 19th century, that was evidence that the Franklin expedition was not doing too badly after 1 year. Because, British Navy, people die all the time. You expect mortality rates, of more than that. There are human remains that are found later, and they're found further south near King William's Island. Those remains are bones, mostly. Bones and I think some skulls they've found. I don't think any of those have been, identified as particular people, but I'm not sure. Yeah. Oh, well, that's a good question. I don't know if my hunch would be that these bones have been so sun bleached and that DNA wouldn't work. But I don't know. It's a great question, and I do know that there's actually an expedition right now to find more Franklin remains by Robert Grenier. So who knows? We might find more stuff within the next few months. Oh yeah. There's a list of all of the members of the Franklin expedition. Yeah.
What about all the wildlife? All the attract mammals and wildlife?
So you asked a question about wildlife. What? There was interest in animals and there were collections made. There were species that were stuffed or that they were brought back home in a variety of conditions. My favorite story is Robert Peary brought back some Arctic mice, and he divided it up, and he gave some of them to the American Museum of Natural History, which examined these mice. I think they were dead already, and discovered they were a new species. So you can find the kind of species write-up of these mice. Then the other part of his mice collection he brought to I think it was the Canadian Club dinner, which diced them up and served them to its elite New York, high-paying members to try to raise money for his next expedition. And that's still, I think, does the Explorers Club still do that? They have a kind of funky meat. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Indeed, Michael, thank you very much for a really wonderful talk. I have very few announcements, the first of which is probably the most important, that Michael will deliver another talk tomorrow afternoon at 3:30 in 116 Gore Hall on a topic that he touched upon this evening, the open polar sea. The second one is a very happy one, that awaiting you out in the lobby is a catered reception with wine and some of the University of Delaware's signature hors d'oeuvres. And we're also treated in having you have the opportunity to purchase one of Michael's books, The Coldest Crucible, for which this talk was named, of course, and he'll be happy to autograph it for you, and your University of Delaware bookstore is giving you a 10% discount on that. And finally, I can't resist Since the issue of the first International Polar Year came up a couple minutes ago, and then also in your talk, and the business about the data and their use, and I would agree with you as insofar as I'm familiar with very much about that. Probably the data aren't used as extensively as they might be, but this is a hometown rah-rah kind of thing we have in our audience tonight. I see him back there, and I'd like him to stand up. A graduate student at the University of Delaware, Mr. Dmitry Streletsky, who has just published a paper that he delivered at the 9th International Conference on Permafrost in Fairbanks this very summer, using data from those 14 expeditions on permafrost temperatures and using them, making the suggestion that they were good baseline data for comparison with current temperatures and those in the future. Really nice paper. So, hometown pride. Okay, well, thanks to everybody for coming out, and to our speakers. It's just been absolutely wonderful. Michael, thank you again, and we'll look forward to your lecture tomorrow. Eat, drink, and be merry.